All right, Jenny, whenever you're ready.
Okay. All right, well, since it's 9:01, let's get started. I know that people are still logging in, but you won't miss much with the intro other than welcome. Oregon Realtors, thank you for joining us for our millionth Navigating Challenges Forum. Okay, a millionth is a little bit of an exaggeration, but a lot since the verdict last Halloween. We've been doing these nonstop to try to keep everyone well informed on what's happening. Today we have a really esteemed panel to share with you what's happened since the last forum, what you can expect with the practice changes, what our two practitioners on this call are doing in their own practices and with their own brokerages. And of course, you'll get the legal risk management side from Jeremy and myself. And I'm here to be the cheerleader for the association and remind you of all the amazing things we do for you, which this is just one of them, keeping you up to speed, but there's 100 other programs and services we do that help you with your business. I know the lawsuits, the settlement, it's been very overwhelming the last 7-8 months, but there is life beyond litigation. So today we have our 2024 president, Ashley Fordham. We have our 2025 president, Brent Landaus, and our general counsel and vice president of public policy, Jeremy Rogers, and myself, Jenny Pakula. I'm your CEO. And we know you're all have fully implemented the changes proposed by your MLSs and what's coming since we've known since April. So this should be a piece of cake. So in all seriousness, I know that this is really overwhelming. It's a lot. It's a lot all at once. But in no time, this will be like any other habit. It'll be just like putting on your shoes. You'll get your practice in check. You'll get your presentation in check. And then the next issue is going to surface, and this is going to be old news. You're all going to be experts and pros in no time at all. So, and we're here to help, and Ashley and Brent are here to help, and whatever we can do, we're here. So, Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you to start the webinar, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, I'm so excited to be here with you all. It feels like D-Day or like D-Day week, I guess is what you would want to call it. For some of you, I know I'm part of 4 different MLSs. For those of you that don't know me, again, I'm Ashley Fordham. I'm your 2024 president. I own and operate Windermere Heritage, which serves Salem, Charbonneau, and Bridgeport. So I have 3 offices, and I also list and sell. I'm in the trenches with you all every single day. So the practical components that we're going to be talking about are real life experiences that I've had as a listing and selling principal broker, but also a manager who has been teaching and training on this for the last 18 months. And I know that my agents are sick and tired of hearing me talk about it, but we are excited to have the opportunity to speak to you all today and sort of give you some practical implementation of what that settlement really is, because we've been talking about this, drop dead date of August 17th for a long time now. And now it's time for us to really get down into the trenches and apply the settlement practice changes into our everyday lives. And I think that this is a good opportunity for you to kind of hear what Brent and I are doing in our individual businesses and in our companies, but also to hear from Jenny and Jeremy the legal implementation of the settlement changes. So Brent, before you and I dive into the practicality of these settlement changes, Jeremy, I would like to lean into you really quickly and just have some conversation about sort of an overview of the settlement, because I think there's been a lot of misinformation about how do we practically apply them and what are really the practice changes that we need to be implementing in our business right now to make sure that we are in compliance and really making sure that we are honoring this settlement agreement.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Ashley. Everyone, again, Jeremy Rogers, the General Counsel and Director of Legal and Government Affairs here at Oregon Realtors. So I'll provide just a little bit of background context on the settlement agreement, and then kind of talk through at an initial level, sort of what does it mean for you at various stages of your engagement with your seller and buyer clients. And then Ashley and Brent can really dive in more detail in terms of what that looks like on the ground. So I think what's most important to understand about sort of how we got here and sort of what the theory behind these changes are is that NAR has been embroiled in various lawsuits related to the sort of longstanding practice of listing agents communicating offers of compensation to buyer agents through an MLS. And the kind of theory behind why plaintiffs in lawsuits that were sellers, as well as the U.S. Department of Justice, believes that that is a problem, is that the theory there is that in that system you have the seller setting the compensation and the listing agent setting the compensation for the services of the buyer agent, even though it's the buyer that's receiving those services. And their belief is that in a functioning marketplace, the buyer and the buyer agent would be the one that set the fee for the services of the buyer agent. And so, these cases that NAR has been embroiled in were class action lawsuits claiming that NAR and other industry players sort of conspired to inflate commissions by operating this system whereby the listing broker was communicating offers of compensation to the buyer broker. So as you all know, NAR lost one of those lawsuits in October. There was a verdict that was reached that was $1.7 billion, would have been tripled to $5.4 billion. And there were copycat lawsuits filed all over the country, essentially taking the same claims and naming local realtor associations, state realtor associations, sometimes local brokerages in communities across the country. That was a huge concern, a huge problem. Those are very expensive lawsuits to defend. And while NAR was planning to appeal, they ultimately reached a settlement agreement that was able to release NAR members from liability related to these similar claims, whether or not that member had already been named in one of these lawsuits. So that release of liability that NAR achieved through the settlement agreement is huge. Also, that NAR was able to achieve through the settlement agreement was reducing the amount to be paid to the plaintiffs to $418 million. Of course, you all are paying NAR dues, so that is a huge victory for the members. But in exchange for that, there are the practice changes, and those practice changes are aimed at creating a system whereby the buyer agent fee is set between the buyer and the buyer agent without influence from the seller or the listing agent. Now, that doesn't mean that the seller can't contribute towards helping the buyer pay their agent fee, as they could any other closing costs. But in terms of setting the compensation level that the buyer's agent is going to earn. So as you all know, by this point, some of the key elements of those practice changes include that any references to compensation will not be included on the MLS, of course, including any references to cooperative compensation between brokers. Those fields either have already been removed from your MLS or are about to be. Each MLS is operating on its own timeline, with August 17th being the hard stop deadline. And of course, there's no fields. You can't mention it in private remarks or public remarks, really, or anywhere else on the MLS. On the buyer side, you have to have a written agreement in place prior to touring a home with a buyer if you are working with that buyer. The key there is you have to be working with the buyer. If you're working for the seller, you don't need a written agreement with the buyer. If you're showing homes to a buyer because you're representing your seller, don't need a written agreement. Okay, it's when you're working with a buyer. Of course, Oregon law also, beginning January 1st, 2025, is going to require the use of written representation agreements with buyers. And we can get into the practicalities sort of as we go on today about sort of the similarities and differences between the NAR requirement and the state law and how to navigate that. And very important, to the point that the buyer agent fee is set between the buyer and the buyer agent in the buyer rep agreement. Okay, that agreement has to describe how the agent is going to be paid, what they're going to be paid, and it has to be objectively ascertainable in that document. It can't be dependent upon what the seller is going to contribute or pay. Okay, so you have to set the fee in that document, and then a second step can be seeking seller contributions towards helping to offset that fee. Also, very important is that the buyer agent cannot accept compensation for services in excess of what was agreed to in the buyer rep agreement. So it really is establishing the compensation level. You can't say, oh, well, the seller's offering more, so I'm going to keep that as a buyer agent. Okay, that's not allowed under the settlement agreement. Those are some of the key highlights. If you go to our website at oregonrealtors.org/BBA, you will find a whole bunch of resources, including an FAQ that lays out in bullet points all of the elements of the practice changes. Okay, but the ones that I just highlighted, I think, are going to be the most important. Of course, documents have been updated. Your listing agreements have been updated to include required statements that the settlement agreement requires. Your buyer representation agreements have been updated as well. Each MLS that provides the listing agreement either has or will be releasing a new one. Oregon Realtors has released a new listing agreement. OREF and Oregon Realtors have both released updated buyer representation agreements and associated documents. One of the key changes in the buyer rep agreement is that issue of not being able to accept compensation in excess of what was agreed to. Okay. Now, Oregon law does not allow rebates to clients of compensation. So if there were a situation that would arise where you had agreed to a fee in a buyer rep agreement and the seller did happen to be offering, compensation that was in excess, you as the buyer agent could not accept it, and you could not pass it on to your client directly either. Okay. That's just sort of the reality of where we're at with Oregon law and the settlement agreement. So let me just kind of provide a quick overview, sort of, for those of you who may be at different phases of a transaction or relationship with your client, of what this may look like for you in terms of steps that need to be taken, and then we'll pass it off to Brent and to Ashley. So for those of you already in contract, you're already the buyer and seller are already in contract on the terms that were agreed to. If there was cooperative compensation included, that was already included as part of that transaction. There's just not really much you can do in that situation, right? Because the parties are already in contract. Really if you're at the stage though where you're not in contract, okay, but you're active, let's say it's an active listing with a seller, you'd use the previous listing agreement, you were perhaps using cooperative compensation in that offer, what would you or in that transaction, or excuse me, that listing, what would you do then? Well, your MLS and Oregon Realtors have all provided a document that would update the listing agreement. Okay. So it's either an addendum or a disclosure document that the seller would sign that would bring the listing agreement in compliance with the settlement agreement. And that includes things like saying that we will not be communicating offers of compensation on the MLS, making clear that, which most listing agreements already did, but making clear that compensation is fully negotiable, and other requirements of the settlement agreement. So definitely consult with your MLS, make sure that you are aware of the documents they've provided that you're supposed to now be incorporating into your listings if they're pre-existing. Again, if you go to oregonrealtors.org/BBA, you can access all the updated documents that Oregon Realtors has created. So now let's talk about listings that are not yet active. Well, there's fully updated listing agreements from all of the providers, the MLSs, Oregon Realtors. So use the new listing agreement. The first question that probably arises then in that situation is, okay, if I'm using a new listing agreement, what are the options if the seller is interested in assisting a buyer and paying a buyer agent fee? And there's really three approaches to that. And I want to talk through those dynamics, and Ashley and Brent can really get into a lot more detail about sort of the market dynamics around those options. So the buyer and seller can just negotiate any seller contributions to buyer brokerage fees, if there are going to be any, in the purchase and sale agreement offer. And of course, what this does, it allows the person who may need the help, the buyer, to be the one to request it. Because not all buyers are going to need help. Some buyers have cash to pay their agent out of pocket, others don't. And so if you let it be negotiated in the sale agreement, it allows the person who needs it to make the ask, and then the seller to respond by either rejecting, accepting, or countering that. Okay, both Oregon Realtors and OREF have updated their sale agreement documents to allow for this to easily occur through the transaction should buyer and seller want that to be a point of the transaction, just like any other closing cost. Okay. All of the updated listing agreements that you'll see from the MLSs and from Oregon Realtors also facilitate this approach. Okay, it's probably it's the cleanest approach to addressing the issue. It also aligns with the U.S. Department of Justice, their view on how the industry should operate, because the U.S. Department of Justice has indicated that they don't believe the settlement agreement goes far enough, because in their view, any upfront offers of compensation from a listing agent or a seller are influencing the amount of compensation that buyer agents are earning. And as we talked about before, their goal is for the fee to be set between the buyer and the buyer agent and the buyer rep agreement. I'm not saying I agree with the Department of Justice view. I think there are a lot of holes in that argument, but we have to recognize that that is in fact their position, and they appear to be continuing to pursue that position. Also, the heart of the lawsuits that occurred was the the upfront setting of an amount to be shared between the listing agent and the buyer's agent of compensation. And while the settlement agreement doesn't say that you can't do that, it just says you can't, talk about that on the MLS. It is certainly a less risky approach to just say, let the buyer and seller negotiate in the sale agreement. The second approach that could be taken, and some listing agreements facilitate this directly, such as at least the latest version I've seen of the Oregon Data Share updated listing agreement, where a seller could include an offer of compensation for the buyer's agent in a listing agreement, but it's from the seller. It's not a portion of the listing agent's fee. The listing agent's fee is just for the listing agent. The seller independently is deciding that they would like to communicate as a marketing incentive to help to pay the buyer agent an amount that the seller wishes to communicate. So that is an option. Some of the listing agreements don't facilitate that directly. Oregon Realtors doesn't. RMLS does not. And so if you were going to do that on some listing agreements that you have, you would have to sort of be writing that in, and certainly would encourage you to connect with your listing agreement provider to check to make sure if they believe that that's even appropriate with their listing agreement. But it's not something, that we're going to be providing language for or anything like that. So it's something you would have to put in there. And as I mentioned, the DOJ does believe that these upfront offers of compensation are a problem, regardless of whether they're coming from the listing agent or the seller. The third approach is the more traditional model of cooperative compensation between a listing broker and a buyer agent, where the listing agreement could set a fee for the overall an overall listing fee, a portion of which the seller and listing agent are agreeing is going to be offered to a buyer agent. Again, under the settlement agreement, that cannot be communicated on an MLS. None of the listing agreements in Oregon that I am aware of that have been updated allow for that or facilitate it. So it would take a lot of extra work for somebody to try to be continuing to use that approach. It is certainly the riskiest approach. That sort of directly is the sort of way of doing this that was at issue in the lawsuits. And you don't have forms for it. The MLS is no longer making that binding between agents, meaning that the brokerages would have to have a separate contract between them that was memorializing that cooperative compensation. Both the buyer and the seller would have to be, aware of and approving of that in advance. It would have to happen in advance of an offer, because otherwise, if the buyer needs to be aware if that brokerage to brokerage compensation is happening, or else they don't know whether or not to ask the seller to contribute toward their agent fee if they need that in the sale agreement. If there is, if they're not, they need to be confident whether or not there's already agreement in place to do that. So there's some timing concerns that arise there. So there's a lot of steps and a lot of risk involved there. and you're not going to be having any, support from any of your forms providers for that type of approach. But it is not expressly prohibited by the settlement agreement. So let's talk about buyers now. So on the buyer side, if the buyer's already in contract to purchase a home, again, there's not really much you can do at that point. They're already in, it's already in contracts between the buyer and the seller, and anything that was agreed to around cooperative compensation is already also in contract. For existing buyer clients that are not in contract to purchase a home, then there must be that written agreement in place prior to touring another home with that buyer, because you're not going to be able to tour another home with them unless you get a written agreement in place. If you'd previously entered a buyer rep agreement, you should either enter into a new one or update your existing agreement to reflect the terms of the settlement practice changes. That includes making sure that your buyer rep agreement states that real estate commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable, that the buyer rep agreement conspicuously discloses the amount and rate of compensation that the buyer's agent will receive, how that amount will be determined, and that it is objectively ascertainable in the document, as we talked about earlier. And also making sure that that buyer rep agreement does not allow the buyer agent to receive compensation in excess of what's agreed to in the buyer rep agreement. So easiest way to do that probably would just be to sign a new agreement, because all of those terms are included in the updated agreements. But there also are a buyer rep agreement amendment addendum that you can write in provisions. Both ORF, I believe, and Oregon Realtors has that if you need to add language to your buyer rep agreement. For new buyer clients, you got to have a written agreement in place prior to touring the home with them. And then also, and this would apply to your current clients as well, but beginning January 1st, 2025, the Oregon law is going to take effect, and you're going to need to have that buyer rep agreement in place. And in that instance, the rep agreement needs to be in place either before or as soon as reasonably practicable after the agent commences efforts to assist the buyer in purchasing a home or identifying a home for purchase. So in some instances, that might mean you need it well before touring a home, because if you and a buyer have agreed that you want to work together and you're sending them listings and talking to them about those listings, but you haven't toured a home, you would need that buyer rep agreement in place under the Oregon law. There will be some additional rulemaking taking place on the details of that Oregon law through the Oregon Real Estate Agency. And we, of course, will provide a lot of training and guidance before that law takes effect January 1st. In terms of on the buyer side, how can they get help from the seller? We talked already about the ways that this can be handled by a seller and a listing agent and a listing agreement. For the buyer, from the buyer's perspective, the buyer in a buyer rep, the buyer can include in their purchase offer to the seller a request for the seller to contribute towards their buyer agent fee, and the seller can accept, reject, or counter that. Okay, as discussed earlier, in some instances, there may be an upfront offer from the seller or from the listing agent. We talked about the dynamics and sort of the risks associated with that earlier, but those are all ways where a buyer could still get help. Again, the cleanest way just being that the buyer requests it in the sale agreement. Both ORF and Oregon Realtors have made it very easy for buyers to do that and for sellers to respond to such requests. So sorry that took longer than I had hoped, but hopefully that was helpful. And I will now shut up. Thank you.
Jeremy, I always love your dissertations. The brevity is your best feature. Okay, so practically speaking,
ouch, Ashley, ouch.
I meant that in like the best compliment possible. He knows that. So in reference, I think that how do you practically implement those, right? Those changes, like that's the hardest part. And so that's kind of what Brent and I want to talk to you all about today. I've seen a lot of posts on social media where people are trying to bifurcate the MLS and create their own like side whatever conversation. We've all seen the pictures of the house with the drone photography and the lawn is mowed to show a percentage. And I just want to highlight just the opportunity in this moment. I always think about the first rule of negotiating, right? It's like, let them say their first number. And I think that the practice, this idea that we need to continue offering compensation to a buyer's side before an offer is even written, sort of doesn't allow the seller to really consider the totality of the offer. And in my opinion, really does, like when you break it down, give this idea that they're sort of negotiating against themselves, right? And I think there's a lot to be said for when a buyer drafts an offer, sends something over, and we're able to just consider the totality of an offer, and the seller gets to make that decision at that time and make the most educated decision rather than just making a blanket offer. I think we as an industry need to get away from this idea that we're going to write a buyer broker service agreement based off of an offer of compensation that the seller is going to be providing us, because the argument is also that there's a buyer side lawsuit that really does have, I think, an interesting argument in that we as an industry have not allowed the buyers to help participate in setting that fee with their agent representative. So as I often say, I just kind of want to break your brains a little bit and encourage you to think about new ways of doing this business. Because when you're sitting down in front of a seller and you say, hey, seller, this is the fee that I charge in order to service your listing to the highest level. This is exactly what you can expect when you choose to hire me. This is exactly the process and how it's going to go. If you want to work with me, these are the expectations, right? Now, when we receive an offer, there may be some closing costs or some buyer side compensation that is negotiated as part of that purchase and sale agreement. And when you're talking to a seller, rather than forcing them or having that coercion of steering into having the seller believe that there is no option to offer compensation, I think that what you could say is, hey, listen, let's just see what the offers present. But I want you to be aware that the quickest way to eliminate a buyer's ability to purchase your property is to not consider paying closing costs and to not consider paying a buyer side compensation should the buyer need it. And at that point, you can really take a look at the totality of an offer. The seller has the ability and understands specifically, like, okay, you know, if the buyer is asking for a high amount of concessions, then maybe there's not as much in the budget for me to offer compensation to the buyer side. So I just want to sort of break your brain, so to speak, and just encourage you to think about the different way of doing business. And on the buyer side, you know, that buyer broker service agreement really does set the tone at the start of the relationship to sort of say, hey, listen, I am a professional. You are entering into a service agreement with me, and these are the expectations of what that service is going to look like if you choose to work with me. Here's the compensation that I would be charging, and this is an agreement, okay? So it's important that the buyer understands that by entering into that agreement, that does not negate their responsibility to pay you. But what it does do is it gives you the ability to negotiate that compensation through the purchase and sale agreement, right? So we've just sort of bifurcated the listing agreement, the buyer's agreement, and then you've got the purchase and sale agreement, which is really the contract between the parties, and you can facilitate those negotiations between the buyer and the seller. I had a question the other day that I thought was pretty interesting. Someone had asked if, you know, as the seller, can I see a copy of the buyer's broker service agreement? And, you know, of course, if the buyer and the listing or buyer's agent are willing to provide a document to the sellers to see that, sure, okay, that's perfectly acceptable. However, when as a buyer's agent have we ever asked to see a copy of the listing contract, right? They're two separate agreements. So I want the industry to just sort of understand that what we're dealing with is really three separate contracts. Okay. We've got the listing contract, we've got the purchase and sale agreement between the buyer and the seller, and then you have the buyer's agreement between the buyer and the buyer's agent. And the two outside contracts don't intertwine, right? Because they're not a party to the other party. So I just want to remind you all that we have this unique ability to just sort of say, hey, we can consider the totality of an offer. This purchase and sale agreement can be negotiated in a way that helps offset the compensation, but that doesn't negate your responsibility to pay this whatever total is. Okay, we're not going to talk totals, but you all know what we're talking about. And there's a lot more semantics in there, but I do feel like there is a lot of value when we're talking to our consumers to say, hey, you know what, seller, I would encourage you not to set a standard and just see what the offers come in at, right? And they are aware that there may be negotiation of concessions and perhaps a buyer's agent or not. And at that time, they can make an educated decision. And then on the buyer side, they just need to understand that the total of that sum of whatever the agreement is their responsibility to pay. And they have the ability to negotiate that through the purchase and sale agreement and see if the seller is willing to consider paying that contribution. So it's the same destination, it's just a different route. And it really does clarify things from both sides of the representation and really just allows the parties to kind of understand what's expected of them on both ends. Brent?
So haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Brent Landells. I'll be your 2025 president of Oregon Realtors. My business is over in Central Oregon. I started selling in '89, and I'm still active in the sales models every weekend. Predominantly my business is new construction. And so the part I wanted to cover, at least initially, and then we'll kind of eventually start getting into some questions. But with my builders, my conversation with them on the listing side of things, we know from our friends in Washington that started this before we did, because they had a state law that requires them to do buyer broker agreements. And we know from our friends over there that about 97% of their contracts still have the seller contributing some portion towards the buyer broker's compensation. So by far and large, nothing really changed as far as the way that people were being compensated, at least in Washington so far. So my conversation with my builders is that still have a line item in your budget, because you have a line for the plumber, you have a line in the budget for the electrician. Let's maintain the line for the buyer broker agreement, but let's let the buyer's broker tell us how much they're worth. It makes a lot more sense from the seller standpoint if the answer is, are you offering buyer compensation? The sense that, that's all remember, our fiduciary responsibility is to our clients. We do not have a fiduciary responsibility to each other within the industry. We are responsible to fair dealings. We are responsible to the code of ethics. We're responsible to be professional. But as far as when we're negotiating, our negotiation loyalty has to be to our client, either to your seller or to your buyer. So when I get a phone call and somebody says, well, are you offering buyer compensation? Yes. Well, what's the number? If I say a number, I am not servicing my client to the best of my abilities. What the answer needs to be to that is, yes, my client is aware that most contracts are going to have a request for buyer broker compensation in it. Ship over the offer. They will take over a look at it as the totality of the offer, as far as does that total number work for them, the number that they're going to end up with at the end of the day. And it's going to be determined by, are they asking for closing costs? Are they asking for a fridge? Are they asking for a washer and dryer? Are they asking for a fence or blinds or all of the stuff that gets thrown into deals? And really, if I tell everybody when they call that, hey, this is what that number is, if I know that my builder's thrown in, 3 refrigerators in the last 3 deals, if the fourth person calls, it has nothing to do with those other deals. And I say, oh yeah, well, they throw in the refrigerators in the last 3 deals. So, write in the offer to add a fridge. All I just did was made refrigerators a standard feature for my builders without my builders making the choice of that being a standard feature. That's the exact same thing I do if I say they're going to pay X amount towards the compensation. We need to break our brains, as Ashley likes to say, and get away from the concept of we are going to do a certain number. The buyer and the buyer's agent should determine what the value of the buyer's services are. And if they need help in facilitating that payment, it's no different than if they need help facilitating closing costs or if they need a fridge. It's the totality of the offer for whoever the seller is that is whether or not they're going to accept that offer, reject the offer, or counter. And those are really our 3 objections. I suppose you could just let it time out, but that's essentially a rejection. One of those 3 things is going to occur. So just don't even worry about the portion of it. And also, the guy who says is like, I'm not paying compensation to a buyer's broker agent. I'm just not going to do it. Well, if he has his house for sale for 500 and the offer is written at 600, but he has to pay buyer broker compensation, he's gonna take the deal and he's going to pay buyer broker compensation. He'd be an idiot not to. He's making an extra $80,000 on the deal. So we have to get out of our heads that we think that this isn't going to be possible. During COVID or right after COVID, when the market exploded, every single one of us wrote offers for above the listing price. If we were going to sell any house, if we were going to win on the purchase on any house, we had to be writing. I mean, there's 23 offers per deal. All of us got used to writing for over the listing amount. So if you have a client who needs to have closing costs and needs to have the buyer broker compensation built into the deal, write the deal for over the listing price. The end result of the final number, how we get from A to W doesn't matter as long as your seller is happy at W. All the minutia in between is just math. So we need to get used to that concept of, instead of pre-negotiating for everybody, that the parties, that the buyer and the seller negotiate, we will facilitate the negotiation and handle the negotiation for them. And at portions, we will be giving them advice of what they should do. But at the end of the day, it has to be their decisions, not us telling them what they have to do. The industry norm is not a thing anymore. It is what any particular broker feels they're worth on the buyer side and whether or not the final number works for the seller in that ask.
I see there's lots of questions on the chat, many as expected that we would get. So I don't know which one of you wants to take that, but maybe a brief summary, whether at the end, on what docs they need to update given where they are with their listings, and then the paying over the agreed upon amount.
Let's I'd say we jump into questions because right now we have a lot of them. And the first one we have is, can a new buyer rep agreement be created for a specific property where a seller may be offering more than previously agreed upon between buyer and seller?
I'm gonna take it.
Well, so there's the legal side, Jeremy and Jenny, which I will jump to you on, but I really want to encourage you as practitioners to get away from this idea that we're going to be pop-tarting between agreements and saying we're going to charge this for this and this for that and amending this and doing that based on what offer of compensation the seller may or may not be making. Because at this point, you need to understand that the verbal offer is not contractual. So let's just say, for example, that you need 3% in closing cost concessions in order for this deal to work, right? That's a substantial amount of money based on the purchase price. And if you write an offer with the understanding that the seller is willing to pay you X% or flat fee or whatever, and you communicate that to your buyer, but the totality of the offer that your buyer is presenting is less than what the seller is willing to do, so they change that compensation amount to less than what your agreement is based on what you wrote, based on your verbal understanding of what the seller was verbally offering, you can see how you're getting yourself into a sticky situation. What we need to do is create a bulletproof process as professionals on the front end before we ever start working with a buyer to say, this is how I work for you. If you choose to engage in my services, this is what you can expect to pay. This is this agreement allows me the ability to navigate the negotiation of that compensation through the purchase and sale agreement, but I make no guarantees that the seller is going to agree to it. This is part of the negotiation, right? So I just want to encourage you all to have a set standard and a set process by which you intake every single client. And you say, I'm going to do A to Z every single time. It doesn't matter if it's my brother, my sister, my cousin, my previous client, somebody who just bought a house a year ago. We have to create a standard in our industry and in our business individually that this is our process. This is the same communication that we're making, and that we're not pop-tarting around all these different compensation agreements. And I'm not your principal broker and I'm not an attorney, but I can tell you that when you start adjusting your compensation, you are no longer serving your client's best interest. You are serving your own. And that is when the DOJ is going to be all over this industry again. I can tell you that they are watching us very closely. And the second that we stop making it about the consumer, that's when we're going to get in trouble. So my advice to you is to stick with a process. Do not change it from property to property. Obviously, there will probably be situations where you need to negotiate with your client, and we all want our clients to win. Ultimately, our number one goal is to see somebody get into a house or a commercial space or whatever. And if our compensation is in the way of their ability to do that on that property, then of course we have, as professionals, the ability to negotiate that compensation. But I'm just going to strongly encourage you not to consider doing that practice. Jeremy, do you have anything to add? Jenny?
No, I totally agree. I mean, we talked about it earlier. The purpose of the settlement agreement, the purpose of the practice changes is for the professional service fee for the buyer agent services to be set between the buyer and the agent. What is being discussed in that question is not that. What's being discussed in that question is still letting the seller or the listing agent set the buyer agent fee. It completely undermines the purpose of what's been trying to be accomplished here. So I would say do not do that.
And one of the things I've noticed since the rules have come out is that technically there might be some practices that aren't a violation of the settlement agreement, but it doesn't mean that's a good idea. I know Jeremy and I think your leadership team are very risk adverse, and we want to keep that litigation train out of Oregon as long as we possibly can. And the more you put a target on your back, the better shot we have of being served. Whether it has merit or not, you still got to pay to get out of it, and it costs money, and we don't want to spend your money on that. There's better tools and other innovative things we can do with your dues dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Agreed. I really would prefer not to have to hire antitrust litigators.
Well, and keep in mind, everybody, also, to me, one of the biggest wins out of the settlement was that each one of us got a liability waiver so that we could not individually be named in a lawsuit. If you start doing things, and you're automatically a party to the settlement, but if your actions take you outside of complying with the settlement, you start getting to where that liability waiver that NAR negotiated for you, you start beginning to go, okay, do I really have a liability waiver? Because I'm not performing to any of the rules that the settlement agreed to. So you're not upholding the settlement in your actions. Do you still have the waiver that was negotiated if we follow the rules? And I'm not an attorney by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm also super risk averse. And I don't want to get into a position to where I'm ignoring the settlement because I think I'm cool. And then I end up getting named individually in a lawsuit because I didn't comply with the rules that the settlement created.
Okay.
And the other thing, one last thing, Ashley, on this point, the other thing that I've heard a lot of is, well, we're really small. They're not going to come after us. We're not talking about the high-end New York, LA type of antitrust plaintiffs lawyers or any plaintiffs lawyers that are really high-end, big antitrust lawsuits. There are so many attorneys that just are looking for a shakedown. It doesn't matter if there's any merit to the case or not. So yeah, you may be small potatoes, but to some attorneys, but there are plenty of other attorneys that would be happy with a $50,000, $100,000 payout. So you don't want to dip in the, I don't even think your would cover it. So let's avoid it at all costs.
Yeah, I don't really want to go there, but hope you guys don't either. Okay, I know we talked a little bit about this, but this question was like, talk about the difference between broker to broker agreement versus listing contract addendum that authorize listing agent to market a seller contribution. I can tell you where I stand with my brokers and my company. I'm not going to allow broker to broker compensation, and we are not going to be offering blanket offers of compensation across the board. From my perspective, I feel like it's best to start the negotiations off on the right foot by saying, hey, our client understands that this is something that's likely going to be negotiated. They are aware, and they're going to consider it with the offer once you submit it. So it's not that we're saying no, but we're not committing to anything, because what I don't want to do is start the negotiations off on the wrong foot. And I certainly don't want my seller to say, I'm willing to do, X number of dollars or percentage, and that be more than what the agreement would have been. And so that puts my seller in a deficit, right? I want the buyer to make the first move and tell us what they're asking for of my client. And I want my client to be in a position where they can negotiate it from there. So, there is a distinct difference, because again, the broker to broker compensation is it's risky. I'm not allowing it. My company, I have a broker policy manual that reflects that. I just think that that's a very dangerous territory to be operating from. Plus the minutia of it. I mean, really, you're going to have a broker to broker compensation agreement signed before an offer is even written, and you're gonna have to do that with every single broker and company, and it's just sounds like a nightmare to me. So I want no part of that. But Jenny and Jeremy, if you have any other legal items to add to that, feel free to jump in.
Well, and just in terms of the documents themselves, like the broker to broker comp agreement, is the document between the two brokerages that would memorialize any comp being shared, and then that would be paired with a listing agreement that included like an overall brokerage fee that included an amount that was going to be shared with the buyer agent. Again, none of your forms facilitate that anymore, right? So you'd have to be figuring out how to do that with somebody else's forms, even if you're going to do it. An amendment to a listing agreement to market a seller contribution is just that. It's like if you got a listing agreement, like say Oregon Realtors or the RMLS, and it doesn't have a space in there just that says we're going to market a seller contribution, but you added an addendum saying seller wants to market X as contribution. You could do that. Again, I would check with RMLS or whichever MLS you use to make sure that you're using their listing agreements in compliance with whatever policies they have. But that is just a marketing. And as Ashley said, it's not binding on anybody, and it's more of just like a suggestion that hey buyers, when you submit your offers, here's something that we'd be willing to do.
Okay, next question. So just to clarify, if the amount offered by the seller exceeds the amount in the buyer's rep agreement, the excess is simply returned to the seller. It cannot be allocated to buyer's closing costs because that would be sharing a broker's commission.
Well, it's a negotiation. So like, again, this is one reason why it may be disadvantageous to your seller to offer an amount up front. You don't know what the buyer agent is agreed to. So if you're offering more, what you've just done is signal to the buyer and the buyer's agent that you now maybe have more wiggle room to negotiate other aspects of the deal. So what's likely to happen is the buyer says, oh, well, we can't accept that, but let's now ask in the offer for something else, because we know that they're willing to do it. So it just would become a negotiating point. And of course, the parties ultimately are the ones that are going to decide what they agree to.
Brent, it looks like I'm getting that fridge. Okay, next question. If we are in withdrawal and haven't gone active yet, is it advised the seller and I just terminate the listing and sign a totally new listing? That is dependent on your broker policy and the MLS that the listing would be subscribed to. Every MLS has a little bit of a different take on that. My belief would be that an addendum would probably be satisfactory to that listing contract, but I'll let the legal ease answer that.
Either way, you can do an addendum or you could do a new one. I mean, I think either way would be sufficient in my opinion.
Okay, so if you already have a signed contract good through 12/31/24, do we really need another form signed since we are not under contract yet? We have a broker to broker agreement stating that seller pays the blank %.
Well, initially on that, I would say you don't have a broker to broker agreement because that went away or goes away in 2 days. Because the MLS system is no longer going to support a contractual agreement between the members of the MLS system. So you don't have a broker to broker agreement unless you individually sign one office to office with all of the different participants that might potentially be looking at showing your home, which that's what when Ashley says it's like this would just be a mess. Even within Central Oregon, I think there's probably 500 different brokerages, and trying to figure that out would just be a disaster.
Well, my question is, have you had a conversation with your seller? Because it's really, your seller needs to be advised of what's taking place in your MLS. And ultimately, if they're instructing you to move forward with the contracts that's in place and verbally offer compensation, you need a written directive to do that. And I don't feel like the current contract kind of outlines that. So from my perspective, I really believe strongly in a mentor of mine said the 4Ds, right? Disclose, discuss, let your client decide, and document. And that is so incredibly crucial in any season, but especially in this season. If you're not documenting your files and you're not giving your clients the power of knowledge to make an educated decision, this is when you get into trouble. So I would probably say you need to have a conversation with your client and then follow your broker policy manual and reflect on your MLS to see what their requirements are. Jeremy, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree.
Okay. Okay, so can you explain a bit more about the not rebating scenario? For example, buyer and buyer's agent have a contract for X amount, and there is a broker to broker agreement that offers over X amount. The additional amount cannot go towards buyer's closing costs, for example. How is that different? How is that different if it is a marketed amount of seller contribution? It goes back to the agreement. What's the agreement between the parties? Is the buyer asking for closing costs and compensation for their agent? I mean, guys, it's kind of like the negotiable inclusions, right, of the MLS. When you sit there and you say the fridge, the range, the microwave, and the fire pit in the backyard are included with your listing. If the buyer doesn't specifically outline that personal property in the inclusion of the offer, it doesn't make it contractual. So I guess in that scenario, you need to make sure that, you know, if there's a offered amount, how you slice that depends on how you write the offer. Right? I guess.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, this is an interesting question, like, because it says in the question, like, if there's a broker to broker agreement in place. So you say, so like there's a broker to broker agreement in place with a higher amount and the buyer agent fee is lower. Can the brokerages, because that's what it is, the broker to broker agreements through the brokerages, like can the brokerages now say, well, okay, we're going to just give X amount to the buyer's agent. Now, the reality is, like, everybody needs to agree on everything that's happening. So if that's a decision that's made, then it's essentially just a renegotiation where all parties sign off on the fact that there's going to be some closing costs, but it's a renegotiation that has to take place no matter what.
Yeah. And all parties better be aware of it and agree to it. I mean, you don't want to do any broker to broker compensation and not allow your buyer to be aware of that. That would be a nightmare. Okay.
Yep.
All right, next question. Wasn't cooperative compensation an issue because it was considered price fixing as an industry-wide standard set by NAR rules, not because the practice of cooperative compensation is inherently unfair to sellers?
Well, let me ask you, I would ask this question. Before the theories of these cases came forward, did anyone believe that a paragraph rule in a handbook from NAR that did not specify any particular amount of compensation that needs to be offered, but just says that offers will be communicated through the MLS, did anyone think that that was an antitrust violation? Well, guess what? A court in Missouri did for billions of dollars. So do you want to be that next MLS policy handbook? Do you want it to be your policy handbook? Do you want it to be the Oregon Realtors? Do you want it to be somebody else who's now the target of the group that facilitated that type of a system? That's what we're trying to avoid. And so I think you got to think about it that way. And think about it this way too. Let's say you operate under this new, like, no communication through the MLS, but you decide to continue to do, and other brokers decide to continue to do broker to broker comp. Now you all are at a breakfast meeting together for your association, or you're somewhere else. Are you going to be talking about that? Right? Like, it just puts you in these situations now where you're setting up other vehicles or avenues to be theories of antitrust violations. Look, I'm not saying I agree with those theories. I'm not saying that'd be a good case. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, why would you want to put yourself in a situation to be the next target of a lawsuit?
Back to Ashley and Brent talking about breaking your brain. All the things that you did every day, and it was technically probably a violation of law, but you don't think about it, are now you're under the microscope. So just, you can't do it. Don't do it. It's not worth the risk. Even though you're like, well, what's the problem? I've been doing it for years. I'm not saying you intentionally tried or attempted to violate antitrust laws or any other laws. It was unintentional, but it was still technically a violation of the law. I mean, that's how we got here on Halloween, because of technical procedural rulings. So it doesn't matter whether it's really harmful or not to the consumer. That wasn't even considered, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's another discussion for another day. Some buyers will be signing it in bad faith in their eyes since they don't have the money. Look, this goes back to what I alluded to earlier about having a bulletproof process, because here's the deal. Whether you're working with a buyer or a seller, like on listings, we do a lot of due diligence, right? We want to make sure we ask questions like, where are you going? What's your timeline? What's your mortgage payoff? We want to provide an estimated net sheet and give them all the resources to make an educated decision. Why are we as an industry not doing the same thing with our buyers up front? I feel very strongly that when you sit down and meet with a buyer and you say, hey, buyer, here's the process. This is what it's going to look like if you want to purchase a home, whether that's your first or your 50th, right? You're going to need cash for an earnest money. You're going to need money for an inspection and an appraisal. And oh, by the way, is your down payment funds liquid? Let's talk about what that means. You as a professional have a job to verify that your buyer is able to participate in the process. And part of that means that they need to understand that you have to get paid. You are a professional, you are providing professional services, and those services do require compensation. We as professionals inherit a lot of liability. I mean, you just look at the number of E&O claims that have taken off in the last 5 to 7 years. We as professionals, no matter how much we try to button up our contracts in a way that's very clean and well done, we inherit a lot of liability on behalf of our clients. And so from my perspective, are there going to be some people who take advantage of this new rule? Yes, absolutely. That's unfortunate. It is what it is. But we also have a job to educate the consumer on how we get paid and what services we provide. And I do feel very strongly that we have to quantify our buyers. Some of our buyers may not be able to hire us. That's just a fact of the matter. But that doesn't negate our responsibility to be clear with them, right? Some buyers don't have the financial means to be able to purchase a property, whether that's compensation or closing costs or down payment or concessions. But how many times have you sat down with a buyer and the buyer says, I need 3% of closing costs, otherwise this deal isn't going to work? I don't ever pick up the phone and call Brent and say, hey, Brent, I'm going to send you an offer, but do you think that your seller will consider paying 3% towards closing costs? Because my buyer doesn't qualify for the loan otherwise, right? I'm just sending it over. I'm writing the best possible offer, giving the seller the opportunity to respond. So we as an industry need to do a better job about quantifying our buyers on the front end to make sure that they understand the expectation, so that they don't get into a situation where that money is owed and they have no way to pay it. So that's my take on it.
And it's really what they qualify for. If they're going to, if you know that they've met with your lender or they've met with a lender and you know what they qualify for, and you know that they have to be able to build the compensation into the contract, and that at that point it's 500,000, you'd be an idiot to be showing them houses that are 750,000 because you know they just don't qualify. And it's not steering to show somebody the houses that they qualify to buy. You know, that's not a ethical issue to not waste your time showing houses that the person can never buy. So if you know what their financial position is, that establishes the ceiling for the price of the houses that you're going to be showing them. And have that conversation with them on the front end of things. So if they do drive by that house and you know it's 700 and you know for a fact they qualify for 5 and they say, hey, can I take a look at this house? You look it up and you go, oh, hey, you know, it's you're never going to be able to qualify for that. So we don't really want to put the owner of the house out and make them leave for an hour so that we can go through and look at their house that you're never ever going to qualify for. That's unprofessional. Showing them things that they actually qualify, including your compensation, is just being a professional in the industry.
We have another question, I think, in reference to my comment earlier. if the buyer is asking the sellers to pay buyer's agent compensation, doesn't the seller have the right to see what the total is to ensure they aren't paying more than what is in the buyer representation agreement? Isn't that protecting our seller? I'm not an attorney, so Jenny and Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, but from my perspective, I don't believe that it's this listing agent or the seller's obligation to confirm that. I think that that's the buyer's responsibility under the settlement to make sure that they're not receiving more than their agreement is stating, correct?
Yeah, we put it right in our sale agreement. So in our sale agreement, if in the section where a buyer can request from the seller, it says that buyer attests that the total amount it does not exceed what they've agreed to in their buyer rep agreement. And just like anything else in the contract, you have to rely on people's legal representations, right? And if they lie about it, that's a material misrepresentation, but that's throughout the contracts, right? We do that on all sorts of things. Now,
Yeah.
it could a seller say, I want to see it? Sure. The seller could counter and say, I want to see it. That's a decision that they could make, but we do have built in as a representation from the seller, just from the buyer, just like many other things that are attested to in the contract.
Well, and
Very
as I
good.
alluded to earlier, if it's asked for, the buyer has the option to say, yeah, I'm okay sharing it or not. But
Yeah.
in my mind, if you have that clause written in there, it's sort of irrelevant. It's just extra paperwork, but whatever. I know that's not a hill I would want to die on. Has there been any input from the lending industry regarding rolling the seller broker fees paid by the buyer into the loan package? No.
So not directly, but it does allow Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and now VA have all agreed that the seller paid contributions can go into the loan just like they have for the last gazillion years, and that this doesn't materially change the situation of what it has been forever, including VA, which VA actually did have a policy in the other direction, and they changed a 40-year policy. After we had Realtor Day at the Capitol in DC, they changed the policy 14 days after we were there, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Your association, it worked for you.
And I think there's a misconception out there. No closing costs are paid for directly in the loan, right? It all is about, lenders don't finance things that aren't tangible assets, right? They need the house. But if you build it into the purchase price, then it gets financed through the loan. If you have room to lower your down payment and then, have more funds available for, brokerage fees or other closing costs, right? There's all sorts of ways that this happens, but it's not as if like every other closing cost gets quote unquote wrapped into the loan, except for this one. No closing costs actually get wrapped into the loan. They're kind of indirectly financed in the ways I've described.
Would it be in our client's best interest to tell buyer's agents to send their offer, that you will share the offer with your seller and they will decide what it if they will help based off the offer details? Look, we act at the directive of our client. So if you have a written directive from your seller that says, hey, I'm not asking you to make a verbal offer, I want to consider everything with the totality, then yeah, absolutely. If Brent calls me up and says, hey, Ashley, I see 123 Main Street is listed. Are you willing to pay, or is your seller willing to pay compensation? I'm going to say, hey, Brent, you know what? My client's aware that that may be part of the negotiation. Send us a written offer. I'll get it presented and they'll have a response back to you. Right. But again, that is a client-led directive. So also office policy, make sure you're talking to your principal broker and you're referring to your office policy as far as what their best practices are going to be for that. Oh, this is a really good question. And Jeremy, this is probably going to lean into our updated buyer representation agreement, but it says, can you discuss the difference between a non-refundable fee for engaging buyer agent services and a retainer? Confirming that there are not any issues with the brokerage accepting non-refundable fees. Would that require a CTA? Would a retainer? CTA, client trust account, for those of you who are wondering. Overall, how do you see brokerages enforcing fees, early termination, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I do think there is a difference between just a non-refundable fee and a retainer, right? A non-refundable fee is something somebody pays and it's not refunded. It's a one-time payment, and there's no sort of special accounting that needs to happen for it. It's just a payment. A retainer, at least a traditional understanding, like in a law firm setting, would be that a client pays an amount up front, which is then drawn down based on the hourly rate of the service provider, as they perform the work. In that situation, it's still the client's money until you've earned it. And so you do need a client trust account. So a retainer model is much more complicated than just a non-refundable fee. In terms of enforcing like either non-refundable upfront fee, early termination fees, et cetera, I mean, you know, professionals in every other industry and contracts that are signed all across this country, thousands, hundreds of thousands of times a day, include those types of fees. And you know, we enter contracts with the expectation that people will abide by them. And of course, those contracts include dispute resolution terms that describe what you do if the one party doesn't comply. And in our buyer rep agreement, that's either going to be a small claims court or it's going to be a mediation, followed by an arbitration if not resolved at mediation. But you know, people are held legally responsible to their obligations, and there are venues through the courts and through the mediation and arbitration process to enforce those. Hopefully you don't have to get to that point. But it's really no different than any other service provider that charges a fee and expects the client to actually pay it.
Okay. Done. Regarding additional money over the list price to take buyer broker compensation into account, do we know how appraisers are going to be taking that into account? A good question, but that's literally just like closing costs. So appraisers are going to consider the market, consider the comparables, and you know, regardless of the overage, whether it's closing cost contribution or compensation, do you think that the offer is going to appraise, or the offer amount is going to appraise? I don't know. It's very, very property market specific. But what if the buyer can't afford BAC unless the seller covers it and the seller doesn't offer enough? Can I accept a lower BAC to get the deal done for them? I have many clients with very little cash available. Good question. Two things. There are some offers that are just not going to come together. That's just the reality and the nature of negotiation, whether that's closing costs, compensation, occupancy. There's any number of things that could make a deal fall apart. But you as a business owner have the decision to say, hey, in order to get this deal together on this specific property, I'm willing to do that. Now, should you be pop-tarting around all the different things? No, you have a set standard, you have a set process, but we also know that as business owners, we want our clients to be successful, and you have a business decision to make. You own and operate a business, and that is your decision. Now, I would probably make sure that that decision aligns with your principal broker and the policy manual. But yeah, pretty simple. Are there sign riders that say courtesy to buyer broker potentially a problem?
I mean, if they were provided by the MLS, they'd probably be a problem, right? So that's one thing. If, you know, again, the settlement agreement itself does not prohibit offers of compensation. It prohibits the MLS being a vehicle for them. But we've also described in this call, throughout this call, many risks associated with it. And including the U.S. Department of Justice continued concern over it. So is it a direct violation of the settlement agreement? I don't think so, and open to others' thoughts. Is it a good idea? That, you know, that's for you to decide based on all the information that we're presenting to you and that's available to you.
So I would counter argue that, Jeremy, and say, as a buyer's agent, how did I find that listing? I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to say that if you have a sign rider that's attached to the property, that the mechanism would still potentially be MLS, which again,
the point is, check with your MLS, because your MLS is the one that has the risk, it has to assess its risk tolerance. It's the one enforcing these. So it's very important that any question you have about, can I do this, can I do that, that you check with your MLS, because if your MLS sees it as something associated with them, then they're going to likely advise you not to do it, and you need to talk to them because they're at risk. So it's very important. Thanks, Ashley.
Yeah.
I would suggest that I would never put one of those on without a written directive from my seller. Because again, it's no different than me putting on a sign in the new construction of free fridge with every home. You know, if my seller doesn't want to be doing, having that out there, I'm certainly not talking about free fridges.
Well, now that I know you are talking about free fridges today. Okay, I have a buyer and he would prefer that I get compensation from seller. But if there is no compensation from seller, he agrees to pay. So my question is how and if it's legal to do it that way. So good question. If your buyer instructs you to initially negotiate the compensation through the purchase and sale agreement, and as part of that negotiation, the seller says, I'm not paying any compensation, then you go back to your buyer and say, hey, buyer, the seller's not willing to offer any compensation through this agreement. What would you like to do? Buyer can pay it. There's nothing limiting the buyer's ability to pay it. It's just if they're instructing you to ask the seller first, then that's what you need to do. But the buyer is always welcome to pay you based off the agreement. I mean, that's really the intention of the agreement. It's just the semantics of how it gets negotiated.
Well, or you can amend your offer and go from list price to list price plus X, and X happens to be the same amount that you're looking to get paid.
Is the new ORF 090 replacing the broker demands we send to escrow, or what's the process in instances where the buyer and seller may be paying portions? I would say your principal broker instructions to escrow need to outline that. And then if the seller's paying compensation, that will be outlined in the purchase and sale agreement where, you know, there's two forms. There's the OR form and the ORAF. They both have a document that you can utilize to kind of outline that, but you just send a package over to escrow and say, here's the principal broker instructions, who's paying what, here's a copy of the buyer service agreement if the buyer's paying you. If you have questions, call your principal broker and or escrow agent. They'll tell you how to get it done. The RMLS listing contract still references paying a cooperative brokerage and buyer's broker and makes it look like the listing agent would be paying a cooperating brokerage from the seller and listing agent set fee. Section 6, the RMLS listing contract seems not to reflect what you're saying here. Adam, have you seen the new documentation? There is some new stuff that's been released. So I would double check that. Say the seller counters the offer and they will not pay buyer's commission, and the buyer says they will not pay it too. What do we do? Buyer did sign the buyer rep agreement and agreement that they would pay it, hoping the seller would accept the offer and agree to pay it. Does it make sense? You don't have a deal. You don't have a deal. I mean, if the buyer can't pay you and the seller's not willing to contribute, then that's not the house for them. Thank you, next. I mean, that's the unfortunate reality of the situation, but also highlights a very important business practice. You have to make sure that your buyer understands this at the start of the relationship. When you enter into that buyer service agreement, they need to understand that they are responsible for paying that compensation. If the seller says, no, I'm not contributing, you don't have a deal. Just like closing costs, you don't have a deal. Thank you, next. We're moving on to the next one. Can I ask the seller for the fridge for buyer and the stove for the buyer's agent? Probably not, unless the stove was part of the compensation written to the buyer rep agreement.
I think that might have been a comment as we were talking about that situation where, like, if there was more an offer that was greater than, could you shift it to concessions? Yeah.
I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me, but I'm not following. What are the forms called that our existing sellers may need to sign? Every MLS has a different form that they need you to sign. So if you have questions and you're listed in any of the various MLSs across the state, please be on the lookout for those emails. I know a lot of times they land in your junk or spam folder, but now's not the time to be avoiding those. And then of course, call your principal broker, make sure you understand what you need to do to be in compliance with your listings and your buyers.
For Oregon Realtors, it's 9.3A. It's like it's a settlement agreement addendum to the listing agreement or something like that. And then most of the MLSs are calling it like, just, listing agreement amendment for settlement or something. So just, you should be able to find it. Yeah.
And I'll just add in here too. So we're talking about what Ashley and I both believe are best practices for our individual businesses. Make sure that you are talking to your managing PBs because they're the ones who are responsible for you. And if they tell you that, no, I disagree with what Brent and Ashley said, I want you to do this, do that, because your managing PB is the one who's responsible for you. Ashley and I are not. So make sure that you're running stuff by your managing PB. So if there's something that feels like it's in a conflict for you.
I have another question that I just really want to run into. Touring agreements. I'm not going to name any names. But there's a question on here about touring agreements, and we'll start signing those so I can tour homes for 1 week with them. Okay, you guys, how do I frame this up? Listen, I understand the hesitation about implementing these agreements, and I do see some of the arguments with a touring agreement. However, my time is extremely valuable. My expertise and my knowledge in the marketplace is worth every single penny. And I am not interested in running around and showing properties to somebody who is not willing to engage in a agency relationship with me. Now, that's my business practice, and you can do whatever you are interested in doing. But I will tell you that when you do this process appropriately and you sit down with your clients and you bring them into your office, or you do a Zoom call because they're out of state or whatever the situation may be, there is flexibility with your buyer rep agreement to say, hey, listen, buyer, you want 123 Main Street and 5678 Browning Street? Okay, we can go tour those properties. I just need your commitment that we're going to work together. And if these properties are of interest to you, then you'll agree to pay me whatever the compensation is going to be. I don't believe that we as an industry should get into this idea that we continually work for free. Your time and your expertise are valuable. And when you sign a touring agreement, I truly believe that that is the misinterpretation of the true intention of creating clarity around the services and the fee that you expect to get paid. So I'm not a fan of them. My company policy is that you will not do them. We will absolutely make things for 1 day. We can make it for 1 hour. We can make it for one property. We can make it for a weekend. But I don't agree with the touring agreement. And I really do feel that when you strongly convey and you have a standard of practice, people respect that. And if they don't want to work with you, Jenny always tells me it's like 100% of your business success is the people you don't do business with. And I so believe that we need to operate from a place of abundance, and we need to believe that our services are valuable, and we provide something that is necessary to our client's success. So that's my opinion on the said touring agreement, and everybody is allowed to have their own opinion and their own practice. But for me and my business, I'm not willing to participate in that. And I need to know that I'm going to be compensated for my time because it's worth it. It's valuable. So.
And for me, I kind of see two questions in here. The first is about the bumpers. The buyer broker agreements allow, under additional provisions, for you to put bumpers on the agreement. You can list it for a certain county, you can put it for a certain city, you can put it for a certain day, you can put it for a price range or a specific house. So it provides the opportunity to provide bumpers to where anybody shouldn't be freaking out about it. And so like with me, I have represented builder that builds statewide, and my buyer broker agreement with them is specific to Deschutes County. They also have other buyer broker agreements in place in the Portland metro area, one for the east side of Portland, one for the west side of Portland. They're mutually exclusive agreements. They're enforceable because of the bumpers we put on them, that in Deschutes County, I'm going to represent them. That has nothing to do with the Portland metro area. The other thing in the question, if you are using a form that is from ORIF or from Oregon Realtors, you have confidence that everything has been vetted by an attorney who has your best interest, because you have a relationship via your membership in the MLS system, or your membership in Oregon Realtors, or through paying ORIF, that they have a responsibility to do what is right for you through those two avenues. If you're using third-party forms that you're getting for free off the internet, you have no relationship with the firm or whoever is providing those free forms to you. You have no agency or contractual or any other type of relationship with them. So if it turns out that that form is not legally correct, or if you get named in a lawsuit because of the said form, there is nobody who's going to stand beside you and say, this is the world's greatest form. And your defense becomes, well, I thought it was a really good legal form. And as all of us are aware, none of us are attorneys, and we can't pretend that we are one on TV. So if you start using third-party forms that you are not in a relationship with the creator of those forms, you are in a very, very, very bad position to defend that decision if you ever get named in a lawsuit. So I absolutely would never use a third-party form that I do not have a relationship with the creator.
I know that Ashley and Brent make this sound so easy, and they've been eating, breathing, and living this for months, and they've made it a regular part of their practice, so it has become easy. But it wasn't always easy, but you just got to do it, and then it's going to be easy for you too. And I agree 100% with these two. You've got to articulate your values, support it, be confident, own it, because that's who people want to do business with. And I know it's a change in business practice, but you all work so hard. You shouldn't work for free. You shouldn't work for free. So we only have about 8 more minutes. Is there a few more questions in there, Ashley?
Yeah, there's a few questions. There is one question kind of about like, which I don't know that we really highlighted. So I want to give you a sample scenario really quickly, just for ease of understanding. Let's say that I've entered into a service agreement with a buyer, and I have set a fee through our buyer broker agreement, and they have identified 3 properties that they want to tour. There's really like 2 schools of thought here for how you can like move forward with this. The first school, which is what I think that our industry is kind of defaulting to, and I absolutely don't agree with it at all, but it is what it is that, hey, I'm going to call those 3 listings that my client has sent me and ask them what the verbal offer of compensation is going to be. And then I'm going to relay that information to my buyer, and my buyer may or may not decide to tour those 3 homes, right? Based on whatever the verbal offer of compensation is going to be. Let's just say that if we are in that scenario and, they go and see house 2 and 3, but they really loved house number 1. But house number 1 wasn't offering the compensation that would offset the buyer broker agreement that I have in place with them. But a couple months down the road, the buyer realizes that their friends ended up purchasing house number 1, which wasn't offering the compensation that they had agreed to pay me. At that point, they're in discussion, as people typically are at, barbecues or parties or whatever. And they find out that they were able to get compensation for the amount that their agreement was with me. And they're like, hey, Ashley, you didn't do your job. You didn't negotiate, right? Are we creating a practice of steering around a perceived verbal offer of compensation, as opposed to this idea of saying, hey, listen, I see that these 3 houses are of interest to you. Let's go tour them and see if the seller is willing to negotiate the compensation, right? We have no guarantee. But in that perception, I never want to be pitted against the idea of steering my clients away based on a verbal offer of compensation. So to break your brains a little bit, I sort of look at it and go, challenge accepted. Because if I send Brent an offer, he knows that it's going to be written and executed, and I'm probably going to get the deal done, and my client's prepared. I've negotiated hundreds of transactions. I know what I'm doing. More than likely, I'm probably going to be worth the fee that I'm commanding, and it's up to a seller to decide whether or not that's something they're willing to do. But I don't ever want my clients to feel like I've steered them based on this compensation that's verbal and not contractual. And it's just opening up a whole new can of worms. So in those 2 schools of thoughts, I just want to challenge you to sort of enter the marketplace with an open mind and say, okay, you know what? The seller may not be willing to accept the offer of compensation that we're asking. And if they are, great. If not, let's devise a plan about what we should or shouldn't do next, right? Disclose, discuss, let your client decide, and document. I really see a world where there's fair housing violations, there's steering conversations. Like, you just need to assume that everything is negotiable and go from there. So if the semantics of the offer work, great. If they don't, on to the next one.
And yeah, you have to be willing to walk away.
Yeah.
You have to just be willing to walk away. Have you, Brent or Ashley, had any practical situations where you've had to walk away because you couldn't help, the seller didn't understand or wouldn't agree?
Yeah. I had a buyer broker agreement with a buyer. So I am predominantly in the WVMLS market, which for those of you who don't know, has already decoupled compensation. So it's just a verbal offer up till the 16th of this month. And so all of our negotiations were occurring in the purchase and sale agreement well in advance to most of these other changes, right? So we were kind of ahead of the curve in our market, so to speak. And my client knew, understood, and said, you know what, you're worth every single penny. And I know that that is a unique situation. This is a client who's worked with me multiple times over the last, 10 years and has a lot of trust and respect for me and my knowledge, and said, you know what, we're not in a financial position to pay you. And if they're not willing to make this deal work, then we're moving on to the next one. And you know what, we found another property, and we ended up getting the full compensation and their closing costs paid, and it worked out, and they were super happy, and they ended up loving the property more. And so I don't want you all as professionals to diminish your value, because if you do it right on the front end and you really take the time to educate and advocate for your client, which I know you all do, but you're super clear in that communication and you don't shy away from leaning into those compensation discussions, your clients are like, yeah, I understand. You're a professional. You have to get paid, right? And we inherit so much liability. I see so many instances where people are so scared to dance around this compensation discussion. And I'm like, you know what? Literally, our clients are asking us to lean into it and create so much clarity and to speak so clear we can't be misunderstood. So I don't know. I want you all to feel encouraged by this change, because you have to change, you have to adopt. And these lawsuits are really from the consumer. They're saying, like, we don't like your practices. So we're literally in the business of change. Let's figure out a new world, new way of doing it.
And Brett, I know for you, that question was you have one client, you're a builder, and I appreciate your approach. It's really numbers. It's all about the numbers, no emotion. It's what pencils out. So when it doesn't pencil out, you have to be willing to do what Ashley just said and move on to the next. And for you, Brett, I'm sure your clients, does it work or it doesn't? What's that?
Yeah, builders are much simpler. It's like the money works or the money doesn't work. But about a third of my business is the traditional real estate. And honestly, Ashley's been doing buyer broker agreements forever. I have not. And the first time that I tried presenting the buyer broker agreement, I completely blew it. It sounded horrific, and it sounded awful. And so then I started practicing with other people in my office. I started practicing with a cat. I practiced with my wife. And the next time around, it sounded a whole lot better. And that's really the key. Practice this to where it does make sense. Nobody goes into the Super Bowl and says, starts drawing up a play in the dirt and says, okay, let's go draw this play. And we have no idea what the blocking schemes are or anything else. It's like, you don't do that in the Super Bowl. You figure it out before you get there. You've practiced it 10,000 times so that everybody knows what they're going to do. This is the same thing. We're professionals at what we do. You practice to where it comes across amazing for everybody when the other team is sitting there going, oh, wow, that was really cool. They just scored a touchdown. That's what we want to get. And you only get there by practicing with each other and practice with people who don't know their lines. That's why you use your spouse, use your kids. They don't know what their lines are supposed to be.
So true. Of course, that's not a great audience because they just want you to be done. So they agree.
Okay, so a couple of things. I have some takeaways, but before we wrap that up, I want to just reference you all to our resource hub at Oregon Realtors. We have a phenomenal outline of every single FAQ, every single resource. We have buyer broker classes that have been taught by Jeff Wyron and Rick Harris and myself and a number of other really incredible instructors. We all have a different flair. We all have a different vibe. And so I would encourage you to watch all of them. I'm sure that there are a number of different platforms that you can utilize. And the beautiful thing about this business is that you can get ideas and make it your own and implement it into your practice. So please make sure that you're checking that resource hub. Obviously, we're going to be creating new developments as things move through, but lean into your principal brokers. Do not be afraid to call your local MLS to get clarification on what you need to do. But now's the time. It's D-Day week, D-Day week. It's like the 7 stages of grief. And now we're in the process of like moving on. We're moving on.
So actually, before you give the attendees your parting words, I just want to share with everyone an event we are hosting with the builders and the bankers on September 17th in Salem, the Oregon Housing Economic Summit. You want to hear from legislators, you want to hear about housing initiatives, solutions to some of the problems we face here in Oregon. It's a great opportunity to come and network with your realtor friends, your home builder friends, your banker friends, and some legislators. September 17th. I don't know, Jeremy, if you can put the link
drop it in
on.
the chat.
Great. And as Ashley said, we have tons of resources. If you can't find it on our website, you certainly, about the lawsuit and the settlement, the rules, you can certainly find it on facts.realtor. Next spring, I know I'm jumping around on our various events where you're going into a long legislative session. So stay tuned for really cool advocacy wins. Our advocacy team is just killing it. And we have Realtor Day at the Capitol, which is our biannual event. Where you get to come visit with your legislators. So stay tuned. Lots of things happening over the next year, and we're spending a lot of time and energy on making sure you're well informed and have the tools you need to get through the settlement. And we're here to answer questions. And I know Jeremy's been on the phone nonstop, as well as Brent and Ashley and other members of the staff team. So we're here to help. That's the value you get for being a member. We'll help you get through it. Piece of cake.
Yeah. And feel free to call Brent and I anytime. We're so happy to help you. Okay, so Brent, do you have anything before I give my final takeaways, my tangible, actionable items?
Yeah, just real quick for everybody, please just, we have the biggest target on us right now. And, NAR and OR are doing amazing jobs to protect us and to make it to where we can still continue to do our jobs in the way that we want to be able to do them. Don't play games with this. Don't intentionally draw a target on your back and say, oh, hey, I'm going to give the finger to the man. It's like, don't do that. That is what we are hated for. Also, it's kind of my biggest pet peeve out of everything. Think about the way that we communicate to our clients all the time. Think about the way that we present ourselves in the world. It's like every spring, every brokerage advertises how many thousand or how many millions of dollars they did. Even McDonald's talks about how many people they served, not how much their hamburgers cost. We are the only industry that sits there and brags about how much money we make, and then wonder why people think that all we care about is money. So when you're advertising and want to try to brag that you're so amazingly awesome, talk about how many families you helped. Talk about how many businesses you helped create. People don't want to be referred to as transactions or sides or deals. So when you're running your advertising and the whole multi-million-dollar club thing, it's like, if you live in Bend, that's one deal in your $1 million club. Our median sales price or median listing price right now is $975,000. So congratulations, you woke up and you fogged a mirror for a year. Talk to the people, talk to our clients, talk to in our advertising in terms that people actually want to be talked about in. Talk to them about, the families that you help. Don't do the stupid thing of just talking about money and then being surprised that they look at us like we're pariahs and, used car salesmen that only care about money when that's all the way that we talk to them all the time. So off my soapbox. Thank you guys all very, very much for attending today. Like Ashley said, Google either one of us, you'll find our phone numbers really fast. We're happy to carry on the conversation. We just want to be responsible to everybody's timing and not like waste everybody's time. So thank you guys all so very, very much. We really appreciate you.
We'll try to answer your questions offline for those whose questions we didn't get to. All
right, so
thank you all.
Before we wrap up, though, I have 4 takeaways that I want you guys to implement. Number 1, educate, don't defend. Okay, so this is super important. You guys, I think a lot of between the news media, consumers have this idea of how we are and how we operate. So if you come from a stance of education and not defense, they're going to be a lot more receptive to hear what you have to say and understand this new way of our business model. Okay. Second, you absolutely 100% need to protect your relationship with the buyer broker agreement. If you're not implementing them yesterday, you absolutely need to be by the 17th. So if you're not comfortable rumbling with that, go take some of our resource classes. We have a lot available for you to utilize. Number 3, this is a phenomenal opportunity for you all to focus on your business. This is the best idea to just dissect every single component, buy side, list side, whichever side you want to, both preferably, and just really identify ways that you could show up differently and really articulate your value in a way that you've not before. And last but not least, this is the most important, you absolutely need to develop a bulletproof process and value proposition. If you don't have a 30-second elevator pitch, you're doing it wrong. If you don't have a value proposition and you don't know what you do better than anybody else, you will struggle in this new season of market. So please do yourself a favor, sit with yourself, really identify ways that you can show up differently, but also figure out what makes you unique in this market and really highlight that as a differentiator when you're talking to your clients. So if you do those 4 things, you're gonna be good.
Thank you all. Thanks, Brent, Jeremy, Ashley. Thank you all for attending.
Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. And Katie, if
Thanks,
we can,
everybody.
Katie, if we can capture the remaining questions, that would be great. We'll try to answer them offline.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, guys.